Hello and welcome to financialexpress.com. I'm Shaleen Agrawal. We are talking about green energy in India and what the upcoming budget 2023 should do for its expansion. We have with us Ramanuj Kumar and Santosh Janakiram, partners at Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas. Ramanuj, Santosh, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
If you could begin with a very quick overview of what the power generation sector in India, where is it at right now, and what has been the role of green energy?
Thank you, Shaleen. As you know, the government has set extremely ambitious targets and has been setting extremely ambitious targets over a number of years. We were to hit about 175 gigawatt by the end of 2022 and move to about 500 gigawatt by about 2030. India's renewable capacity has increased by about 396% over the last 8.5 years and has crossed 159 gigawatts. It should be today more than that. I'm now talking about a few months ago. This includes things like large hydro and constitutes about 40% of India's total capacity. Again, this data is last year, 31st of March 2022. As we get more and more data, this is going to get more and more interesting. Solar capacity alone, by the way, has increased by 19.3 times in the last 8 years. And it stands at about 57 gigawatt as of June last year, which is when the data is available with us. So as you can see, just simply from 2014 to about May 22, we have gone from 76 gigawatt to about 160 gigawatt. That's an incredible amount of addition. And out of a total power capacity of about 408 gigawatts in the country. So this is the size that we are talking about. We're still only at 160, I will say, and maybe a few gigawatt more. And we want to hit 500. So this is both the size that it is today and the size of the opportunity that is there.
Will we hit 500 in the stipulated time?
My own belief is that we'll get pretty close.
Okay. So what kind of investments are required to reach to $500 billion, 500 gigawatt by 2030?
I don't have an exact number for you, but if you were to say about in the region of $800,000 per megawatt that you need to build, this is another 340 gigawatts. That's 340,000 megawatts. That's an incredible amount of money. I think it'll be upward of $100 billion.
So there are some studies, Shaleen, just to pick up from Santosh. So there are some estimates made by some of consultancies and like your Bloomberg, NEF and all that. So they estimate that India would require something in the order of $500 billion in the next 8 years if we are to reach the 500 megawatt renewable capacity. So that includes your net new capacity additions of about 370 gigawatts of renewable, plus the investments in the transmission infrastructure, which is required to bring those renewables to the point of consumption, and also the additional energy storage required to bring the grid balancing requirement. So generation, transmission, and minimum energy storage requirement to bring the grid to balance, we are looking at upwards of $500 billion in next 8 years.
Does the transmission network have to be separate for the new capacity, or can the existing transmission network be used?
No, it will not be separate, but the existing transmission network will need to be augmented and expanded considerably to accommodate your renewables to the order of 3 times of what we are talking today. And given that your base load coal capacity is going to go down in proportionate terms, and more renewables are coming to the grid, your grid needs to be much more stronger and flexible to meet the intermittency of the more renewables into the grid, and also be more flexible to accommodate additional infirm power coming into the grid. So that means that the grid investments will be much larger. And if you look at the government plans, government has already set out sort of some targets to to green the grid to accommodate this capacity. Now these are all estimates. Probably depending on where international supply demand market goes, we may even sort of need more than this amount.
We spoke about requirement of about $500 billion. Where will the money come from? And then very quickly on this, before we move on to what can the government do in the upcoming budget?
Where will the money come from? 3 or 4 big sources. And we'll talk about the most obvious one in the end. The first big source has to be debt financing. Debt financing is kind of broken up into two, which will be debt, which is from within the country and debt from outside the country. When we are talking about this kind of spending, it's not sufficient that we will have debt from only within the country. It's very, very critical that you have a very, very large chunk of this coming from outside. So which will mean an external debt market, an external bond market, 2 important sources. And domestically, we will have to look at the bank market and we will have to look at the bond market, both of these, which needs significant capacity augmentation from a financial capacity point of view, particularly the bond market. And so therefore, we will look at players like insurance, all of these other guys. Number 2 is the equity side of the business. The equity side of the business, if you see, has largely been moving towards larger players, consolidation. So it needs scale, it needs the capability for deep pockets, and it needs the ability to raise capital quickly, cheaply, and well. So this is the second critical element. Again, there is an offshore and an onshore element. You have instruments like InvITs, you have listed capital coming in, and you will have private capital that will always go into this, particularly in cutting edge technologies or new age work. The third is obviously the government, which I think we should kind of not discount. The government's, and I think that leads into the budget in many ways. The government's contribution to making some of this work, particularly new technologies, new areas of development, be it grid storage, be it off-grid storage, be it different kinds of energies, will be important. The VGF mechanism worked quite well for the solar industry for a few years. Now they are standing on their own 2 feet and doing well. The PLI mechanism has just been launched to make sure that there is manufacture of solar cells in India and panels in India. Now those are the kind of things that that the government can contribute. Some of it money, some of it policy. So these are the 3 big points or 3 of resource mobilization that we will be looking at.
I just want to spend a minute on overseas debt financing that you spoke about. Overseas debt financing has not been very successful for India in several other areas of infrastructure. Government has been, and several governments over the last several years or several terms have been trying to augment overseas debt financing for infrastructure projects. What gives you the confidence that it will work for solar or renewable energy industry this time?
The success of it over the last few years, frankly. I don't have the statistics with me, but a large chunk of high quality projects have been financed by offshore lenders, be it the multilaterals, be it the commercial banks, be it specialized lenders who focus on this. They have put in a lot of money into the debt element of it over the last 3-4 years. That's one part. The second part is the maturity of the sector. When we looked at 2014, there was one global bond issuance from India, which happened in 2014. When we look at 2022, there would have been at least 12 to 14 issuances which have happened and refinanced and then refinanced again in the global bond markets, crossing more than $5-6 billion on their own as we stand. So when we look at both of these kind of outcomes, there is a fair amount of confidence that the global bond markets, particularly for Indian renewable sector, are going to be a big basis for support. There is more than enough activity, there is more than enough confidence, and there is more than enough kind of track record that the Indian renewable sector has proven for this to be optimistic.
So that kind of confidence with the debt financing providers, has that come in because of the larger and more mature private sector players entering into the sector, or has that also come in part at least because of some government policies or actions?
So it's a combination of both. So like in India, I don't think you can attribute any one reason for anything happening well or badly. But I think you will see that there are mid-level players and large players, both who have accessed the bond market and fairly successfully. You will also see that a large chunk of that financing has happened on the back of government policies, where either SECI is an off-taker or NTPC is an off-taker, where you have strong central intermediaries who have the backing of the government and the policies and the bids, and frankly the money that they have the capability to buy. So it's always a combination of both of these. As we go along, perhaps the dependence on government will come down, but I think that at least for the purposes of offtake, for the purposes of grid stability, for the purposes of making sure that we have the rights and policies, the ability to transmit all of these, I think all of these are going to be important elements where the government is going to have to contribute.
Let's come to budget 2023. What is it that the government can do right now to give a further boost to renewables sector in India?
Ramanuj?
See, I think, Shaleen, budget has sort of, in a sense, ceased to be the sort of, center point of, policy pronouncements at least for the renewable sector. And as you could see that throughout the year, renewable sector has seen a lot of sort of, policy pronouncements, support pronouncements. So if you take the immediate context, for example, so like green hydrogen mission, the center has announced, nearly 20,000 crores of incentives, right? One, to start with, the budget will need to make a provision for it, that, where that 20,000 crore is going to come from. So one, that needs to make a provision. Second, I think, on the renewable side itself, you need sort of, large allocation for PLI scheme for the electrolyzer, which has been sort of, in the works for some time. So similar to other PLI schemes, for example, for the solar module sector, for advanced chemistry cell battery sector, you will need to have an allocation made for to support the PLI scheme for the electrolyzer manufacturing, because without sort of local electrolyzer manufacturing capacity in place, it would be difficult to, let's say, meet the target of 5 million tons per annum capacity of green hydrogen domestic manufacturing by 2030.
Yeah, but then the electrolyzer manufacturing was part of the 20,000 green hydrogen itself.
That's for the first phase. That's for the first phase. But I think there is a separate PLI scheme that will need to be announced, because this 20,000 crore would not be sufficient. If you look at the entire 5 million metric tons capacity to be supported, then and which sort of support will be distributed between the electrolyzer manufacturing as well as the green hydrogen production itself. So the more financial outlay would be required. Someone sort of one may also look at sort of financing costs are going up, right, in the obviously increasing interest rate environment. Government will need to sort of look at least for the sort of new technology products, including, for example, green hydrogen, energy storage, whether it could announce some kind of support schemes, at least for the initial set of projects, from the budgetary resources to support offtake of these projects and products, where sort of banks would be hesitant to, let's say, take the technology risk and the project execution risk, at least in the initial phase. So this would be something similar to your what VGF was doing in the renewable space, let's say 7-8 years back, where the sort of financial incentives were being provided to set up these projects. So I think the renewables, as Santosh mentioned, renewables, solar, wind, and hybrid has matured. The newest technologies, such as your energy storage, different kind of storage solutions, and the green hydrogen and green ammonia as an energy carrier, and as well as the energy vector. These solutions and projects, they will require greater support and greater financial commitment. You have the announcement of $2 billion of proposed green hydrogen, green bond scheme, sovereign green bond scheme to be done by the center. This is the first phase, and once this is successful, we should expect the government to sort of expand the sovereign green bond offerings. And obviously these will be deployed to, intent is to deploy to sort of support PSU projects. But once you have these resources being deployed in PSU projects, it will create sort of a cycle of demand, which will sort of, because part of the contracts and demands will also go to the private sector. So that itself will sort of will be demand stimulating and will require sort of will create sort of scope for more private investment from private players.
Do you see the solar PLI allocations rising further in this budget, upcoming budget?
So I think the initial allocation at least will have to be exhausted first. But given what we are aiming for, that is 500 gigawatt by 2030, we will probably need somewhere in the region of 60 to 70 gigawatts of manufacturing capacity per annum in the solar cells and module space. So yes, there is a scope to increase that further, but it will all depend on what the international supply demand situation is, and how much our domestic industries able to expand and mature without sort of relying on the government support. I suspect we will see a curve where the need for the government support gradually decreases, because as the industry mature and economy of scale is achieved, the cost curve should come down. And as the domestic sort of offtake of domestically produced modules goes up, we should see the domestic manufacturers becoming more competitive without necessarily need for government support.
What has been India's experience so far with the solar PLI scheme?
So we are still in early stages, and sort of but so far I would say the experience has been positive. Most of your domestic manufacturers are positive. They are seeing sort of almost full order books, and if you talk to the generators, sometimes they complain that domestic manufacturing capacity is not enough to meet their requirements, and sort of the BCD as well as the duty increases which were done to support the domestic manufacturing, those are still in place, and I suspect that those will remain in place for some time to let the domestic industry mature and fill the demand required.
Taking financing further, is there any mandate that the government should put on the financial sector, like priority sector funding mandate or anything like that, to accelerate the funding of renewable power sector?
So let me jump in.
Sure.
If you'll see, RBI came out with a discussion paper last year, which was on, it said green finance, but it actually went a little further. It was on sustainable financing practices, not just from asset side, but also for the banks themselves to kind of come up the curve. It laid out a fairly comprehensive framework as to how they should be thinking about it. It started obviously because given it's RBI, it started with the banks and eventually will go to the large NBFCs as well. I think that's a good first step. It needs implementation. I mean, all the relevant kind of actors in that have provided comments to RBI and where they think. And what does that propose? That proposes incentives. That proposes thought processes where you will get certain capital benefits or other related benefits for lending. It proposes capacity building from a training point of view, making sure that the bankers are actually up the curve in understanding how to assess the credit of this. And it also requires the banks themselves internally to look at this and make themselves green. So if you look at this, there is already a thought process. SEBI has the green bonds framework. IFSCA, which is Gift City, the Gift City administrator has a green bonds framework. So there is a thought process that has come in. Obviously, BRSR for the reporting side for listed companies is also there. Little less impactful for the purposes of getting banks to put more money or financial institutions. but it will move to a point where the borrowers themselves, which is these companies, listed companies, will then look to comply with BRSR and therefore look for green sources of capital. So all of these are things in motion at this point in time, Shaleen, and they're all good things in motion. I would just hope that they come into play faster rather than later, so that we can get on with this story. We can get on with building this out rather than actually, talking about policies.
Current RBI policies allow, renewable sector lending up to 300 million or 30 crores, for small scale solar and wind projects, etc., to be counted towards priority sector lending obligation. Some of the banks have been sort of, quite vocal that limit should be increased, and the basket of renewable sector eligible projects should also be expanded to sort of, allow more projects to come in, and also the limit should be increased so that especially MNC banks, that it helps them meet the priority sector lending requirement, because obviously they don't necessarily lend to your rural sector or agri sector, which the domestic banks do. So there is a sort of what you would call some logic and some sort of industry backing for that kind of policy move. We don't know whether RBI is sort of supportive of that kind, because it can create moral hazard in terms of what one would call a directed lending policy, and that always has its sort of own sort of disadvantages. What we would like to see, from our perspective, is that there should definitely be some kind of trajectory, let's say, as a policy signal to the banks that that there should be, let's say, that in next 10 years, where the domestic financial institutions should reach in terms of a portion of their green lending, out of their entire portfolio. So it would be more of a policy signal rather than a policy on directed lending, which could sort of nudge the banks to do more on the green project side.
Whatever different various support measures that we spoke about, does the government has as much space or the financial bandwidth to provide to this sector? Either of you can take that.
Yeah, Ramanuj, you were smiling.
Well, yeah, no, I was smiling, because as a developing country, we are always in a sort of competition for allocation of resources. We always need more than what our tax revenues or non-tax revenues can support. So it's always a delicate balancing act for the government. I don't think that we can or any of us can answer the question that does the government have enough.
Where do you think renewable energy is in the priority list of the government in this very budget? I think on the list of things to do.
No doubt it will be high on priority, Shaleen. Renewable energy and energy transition, decarbonization has been very high on the government's agenda, as we see beginning with COP26 announcement, and then sort of release of India's long-term strategy for decarbonization, release of national green hydrogen mission, announcement of incentives for the green hydrogen mission. The policy moves that we have seen in the renewable energy sector itself, including sort of easing of green open access rules, a recent announcement of amendments in the electricity rules, the electricity amendment bill, which is pending before the standing select committee of the parliament to for vetting. So it clearly shows that the government is very keen and extremely proactive so far as the energy transition and green agenda is concerned. Resource allocation, as I said, would always be a question of how much is available and what are the political priorities of the government at any point in time. But on balance, I think the sort of renewable energy is very high on priority.
Sure, but see, equally important are right now for India infrastructure building manufacturing capacities. Is India really in a position to think that much about green energy sources or carbon emissions? Because the other industrialized nations, they got their way by industrializing when these things were not on the agenda.
I don't think we can afford to think in terms of either or. Both are priorities for us. In terms of geopolitics, yes, it is proper to apportion greater part of the responsibility on the industrialized world. But I think for our own sake, at the stage of growth and social development that we are in, and if you see the sort of perennial pollution problem some of our largest cities and urban conglomerates are facing every day, especially in Delhi, for example, if you see, I think greening of our industry, our grid, and our power generation sources at a faster pace is good for us as a country and a society. It will, of course, require allocation of resources. It will require, redirection of policies. It may even, in short term, compromise some of our sort of, growth, let's say, as compared to a business as usual scenario. If you are, for example, continue to rely on coal and oil and gas to support our growth agenda. But fact of the matter is that, we don't have energy security on our own. We continue to rely on imported fossil fuel to meet sort of 70-80% of our needs. So in fact, it fits into our energy security, affordability, and the development agenda that we invest appropriate portion of our resources into reducing dependence on fossil fuel and increasing the share of renewables and increasing the share of sort of other alternative energy sources, so that it creates a new economy, so to say, and also saves us dependence on imported energy sources, and also obviously saves sort of creates more domestic jobs and domestic demand in the new sectors. So I think it fits in our with our sort of priority as a country.
See, to add to that, I mean, it has a virtuous cycle impact, right? If you look at this, the greening of the energy systems, the moving into green hydrogen, the use of electric vehicles, the greening of the charging infrastructure, the utilization of all of this, and therefore developing the EV sector and manufacturing directly goes into energy security in terms of the dependence, in terms of the use for natural resources, in terms of the capability to kind of get to that. So it creates a kind of a virtuous cycle as far as we are concerned. The pain points are a few years in the beginning, but in reality, over the next 7 to 10 years, I think it's a proper virtuous cycle. That's one. The second is the source of money. Now, whether we like it or not, larger and larger chunks of global capital are going towards green. And if you are not in the green cycle, or if you're an industry which is not focusing on green, if you're not a conglomerate which has a very clear green strategy and reducing the carbon footprint, greening their own ecosystem, both backward integration and forward integration, your ability to bring capital is severely impacted, both debt and equity. So there is already an impetus to move in this from a pure financial point of view. So we should not forget that money really does matter here.
Very last question. In that case, and very quickly, is there a case for carbon tax in India?
So, Shaleen, I think there is a case for carbon tax in India. How it is implemented and when it is implemented, that is going to be the key question, and on whom it is implemented. If you look at what's happening around us, if you look at, for example, what's happening in the EU has already proposed a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is nothing but carbon tax for imports into the EU from countries which are not imposing any carbon tax, or let's say pollution tax for that matter. We have an implicit carbon tax on sort of our fossil fuels and our sort of energy sources. It's just that it's not called carbon tax. McKinsey study shows that all the excise duties and your GST compensation cess, which is collected on your coal as an energy source, all of that roughly amounts to $140 a ton of implicit carbon tax. We don't call it carbon tax. I think we need to rethink and redesign our taxation on fossil fuel energy sources, combine them into one comprehensive sort of taxation measure, and probably give them the name of carbon tax, or give them another internationally acceptable name, which will achieve two sort of one, it will send a policy signal that government is serious about curbing uninhibited use of fossil fuel as an energy source and redirecting the economy towards the greener sources. Two, it will also help us from an international competitiveness and export perspective, that you don't have to face, let's say, your trade problem where our export to, for example, EU, or tomorrow it could be some other markets, could be restricted because we don't impose a tax what they have decided to call a carbon tax. So I think we need to sort of have a proper sort of planning and thinking in that direction.
I think the when is going to be critical. I think Ramanuj spoke about both the what and the when, but the when is going to be very critical. I think it's important that we don't add any more taxes. This is really, at this point in time at least, for this purpose, it's really re-nomenclature or rejigging the system to make it clearer, potentially. And from a when point of view, give industry enough time to kind of get up the curve and clean themselves up before you do incremental taxation. I don't think there is a case for incremental taxation at this point.
Sure, we'll end it here, Ramanuj, Santosh. It was a very good discussion, and we hope to continue with this discussion as we move closer to the budget and after that as well.
Sure.
Ramanuj, Santosh, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.